What do you do when God is completely silent and your life is falling apart? What do you do when the prayers keep rising but heaven says nothing back? When the pain is real, the loss is deep, the nights are long, and the God you trust seems quiet. This is not just a question for weak people. This is not just a question for people far from faith. This is one of the deepest spiritual battles in the Christian life, because nothing tests faith like the silence of God. Nothing exposes the heart quite like suffering without explanation. And that is exactly why the story of Job still shakes people to this day. Job is not introduced as a rebel. He is not introduced as a careless man, or a hypocrite, or someone living in open disobedience. The Bible presents Job as a righteous man, a faithful man, a man who feared God and turned away from evil. He was blessed. He had a family. He had wealth. He had influence. He had stability. In many ways, Job's life looked like the kind of life people assume God should protect from disaster. He was the kind of man many would point to and say, "There is a man living right before God." And yet, in what feels almost impossible to understand, everything begins to collapse. In a sudden and devastating sequence of events, Job loses his children. He loses his wealth. He loses the security he built. Then his own body is struck with suffering. His health is shattered. His peace is destroyed. His life is no longer recognizable. The man who once stood in blessing now sits in agony. And this is where the story becomes painfully personal for so many people watching right now, because maybe that is exactly how your life has felt. One season everything looked stable and then suddenly everything started breaking at once. A loss you did not expect. A door that closed without warning. A prayer that seemed urgent, but no answer came. A grief so heavy that even getting through the day became its own kind of battle. And here is what makes the book of Job so unsettling, so powerful, and so spiritually intense. God does not explain everything to Job, not at the beginning, not in the middle of the pain. Job suffers, cries, questions, mourns, and searches, but the silence remains. That is the crisis of faith. Not only the pain itself, but the silence in the middle of it. Not only the storm, but the fact that heaven seems closed while the storm is raging. That is where many believers begin to struggle, because pain is hard, but unexplained pain is even harder. Suffering hurts, but suffering without clear answers can shake the soul to its core. And maybe that is why this message matters so much, because there are people listening right now who know exactly what that feels like. You prayed, but God seemed silent. You asked for direction, but nothing changed. You begged for healing, for restoration, for intervention, and instead of clarity, you got silence. And when the silence of God lasts longer than expected, it can begin to feel like abandonment. It can begin to whisper dangerous thoughts into the mind. Did God forget me? Did I do something wrong? Is he far from me? Does he even see what I am going through? These are the kinds of questions suffering brings to the surface, and the book of Job does not ignore them. It forces us to face them, because the silence of God is not always the absence of God, but when you are in pain, it can feel that way. And that tension is where this story begins to reach into the deepest parts of human experience. Job's crisis is not just ancient history, it is the language of every believer who has cried in the dark and heard no immediate reply. It is the story of faith under pressure, faith under pain, faith under mystery. And before we go any further, I want you to stay with this, because the next part takes us even deeper into what makes Job's suffering so difficult to understand. Not just that he suffered, but that he suffered while still trying to hold on to God. Then the silence gets even heavier, because when God does not answer immediately, something else almost always happens. Other voices rush in to explain your pain. This is exactly what happened to Job. He was not only crushed by loss, grief, confusion, and physical suffering, he was also surrounded by people who sounded spiritual, people who sounded confident, people who sounded like they knew exactly what God was doing. And that is where this part of the story becomes painfully real for so many people listening right now. Because sometimes the deepest wound is not only what you are going through, but what people say to you while you are going through it. Job's friends arrived at first in silence, and in the beginning that silence was actually wise. They sat with him. They wept. They saw the weight of his suffering. But then they began to speak, and the moment they started explaining everything, they started missing everything. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar each came with the same basic assumption, even if they said it in different ways. Their theology sounded clean, ordered, and religious. If you are suffering like this, you must have done something wrong. If your life is falling apart, there must be hidden sin. If God has allowed this kind of pain, then surely you are being punished. That was their framework, that was their certainty, and that is what made their words so dangerous. Because when a person is already broken, the wrong explanation can feel heavier than the suffering itself. Job had lost his children. Job had lost his wealth. Job had lost his health. Job was sitting in ashes, covered in pain, trying to understand a silence he could not interpret. And while heaven gave no immediate explanation, earth was full of opinions. His friends kept talking as if pain always comes with a simple formula, as if every tragedy can be traced back to a personal failure, as if all suffering is proof of guilt. But the reader knows what they do not know. They are wrong, deeply wrong, confidently wrong, spiritually wrong, and that is what makes the book of Job so powerful for anyone who has ever suffered under religious judgment. Because even today, when God seems silent, the wrong voices still speak loudly. Some people will tell you that your suffering is the result of weak faith. Others will say that if you had prayed harder, obeyed more, trusted deeper, given more, spoken better, declared the right words, then none of this would have happened. Some will hand you cold religious slogans while your heart is bleeding. Some will throw Bible verses at your pain without tenderness, without wisdom, without context. Some will speak with certainty where God Himself has not spoken. And that is one of the most dangerous things in the spiritual life, when human voices become louder than divine truth. This is why the silence of God can become such a battlefield for faith. Because when God is silent, you become vulnerable to every other voice that wants to interpret your pain for you. The voice of accusation, the voice of shame, the voice of toxic religion, the voice of shallow judgment, the voice that tells you God is against you, the voice that tells you this proves you are forgotten, the voice that tells you your suffering must mean your failure. And the terrifying part is that these voices often sound spiritual. They use the language of holiness. They borrow the tone of wisdom. They come wrapped in religious certainty. But not every spiritual voice comes from God. Not every explanation for your pain is truth. Not every confident answer deserves your trust. That is one of the deepest lessons in Job, and it hits hard because it exposes something many people do not want to admit. You can speak about God and still completely misrepresent Him. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were not pagans mocking Job. They were not atheists rejecting God. They were men trying to explain suffering in the name of God, and yet they turned out to be false interpreters of Job's pain. That should make every listener stop and think, because some of the most damaging lies in a season of suffering do not come from obvious enemies. They come from voices that sound religious, familiar, biblical, and authoritative. They come from people who mean to help, but end up increasing the burden. They come from those who would rather protect their system than sit honestly inside a mystery they cannot solve. And maybe that is exactly where this connects with someone watching now. Maybe your greatest struggle was not only the loss, the betrayal, the diagnosis, the delay, the closed door, or the silence of heaven. Maybe your greatest struggle was what people said afterward. Maybe someone told you that if your life was blessed before and broken now, then clearly God exposed something in you. Maybe someone made you feel like your tears were evidence of spiritual weakness. Maybe someone used your suffering to preach at you instead of love you. Maybe someone reduced your pain to a formula. And because they sounded spiritual, part of you started to wonder if they were right. That is the cruel power of the wrong voices in the silence. When God does not immediately answer, false explanations start to feel believable. Job's friends could not handle mystery, so they replaced mystery with accusation. They could not tolerate not knowing, so they built certainty out of assumption. They saw suffering and immediately connected it to personal sin, because their theology had no room for righteous pain, no room for unexplained suffering, no room for a God whose purposes are deeper than human formulas. But real life is not that simple, and the Bible itself refuses that shallow system. Job was not suffering because he was secretly wicked. He was suffering in the middle of a larger reality he could not see, and that matters, because it means pain is not always a verdict. Suffering is not always punishment. Hardship is not always proof that God has turned away. Sometimes the most faithful people walk through the darkest valleys. Sometimes the most righteous people endure the longest silence. Sometimes the holiest seasons are also the most confusing ones. This is why discernment becomes so critical in seasons of pain. When life collapses and heaven feels quiet, you cannot afford to believe every voice that interprets your suffering. You cannot give every opinion authority over your soul. You cannot let toxic religion define the character of God for you, because the wrong voice, heard long enough, can reshape how you see God, how you see yourself, and how you endure pain. And once that happens, suffering becomes more than suffering. It becomes distortion. It becomes spiritual confusion. It becomes an internal war where you are not only hurting, but also questioning whether God is cruel, whether grace is real, whether your pain is proof of rejection. That is why Job pushes back. He is confused, yes. He is broken, yes. He is desperate, yes. But he refuses to simply accept every explanation placed on his suffering, and in that refusal there is something powerful, because sometimes faith is not pretending to understand. Sometimes faith is refusing to call a lie the truth just because it sounds religious. If this part is speaking to you, comment, "Not every voice is from God," or even, "God, silence the wrong voices" below. And as we keep going, the tension only grows, because Job is not just dealing with pain and bad theology now. He is about to wrestle with something even deeper. How do you keep talking to God when your heart is shattered, your mind is full of questions, and the silence still has not broken? What if one of the hardest truths in the Christian life is not that God says no, but that God says nothing at all? That is where the book of Job becomes so deep, so unsettling, and so powerful. Because by the time Job reaches the darkest part of his suffering, he is not just dealing with pain, he is dealing with silence. He is dealing with the crushing weight of unanswered prayer, unexplained loss, and a heaven that seems closed. And this is where the story grows in depth, because the audience is allowed to see something Job cannot see. Job is living through agony on earth, but behind that agony there is a spiritual reality unfolding that he knows absolutely nothing about. In Job 1 and 2, we are shown a scene beyond human sight, a heavenly dimension, a reality in the spiritual world that completely changes how we understand the silence of God. Job thinks he is trapped inside chaos. He thinks his world has fallen apart without explanation. He thinks he has been left to suffer in confusion. But the truth is that God is not absent for 1 second. God is not distracted. God is not late. God is not powerless. God is not trying to figure out what to do next. While Job sits in ashes, while his body aches, while his heart breaks, while his mind spirals through grief and confusion, God is still reigning, still governing, still setting limits, still watching, still sustaining, and still working at a level Job cannot yet understand. And that changes everything, because one of the biggest lies people believe in seasons of suffering is that silence means distance. We assume that if God is quiet, he must be far away. If heaven feels still, we assume heaven has forgotten us. If answers are delayed, we assume love has been withdrawn. But the story of Job destroys that shallow idea. The silence of God is not the abandonment of God. The silence of God is not the weakness of God. The silence of God is not the loss of control. In fact, one of the most important biblical truths in the book of Job is this: God may be silent, but he is never inactive. He may not be explaining himself, but he is never absent from the process. He may not be answering in the way Job wants, but he is still completely involved in what Job is living through. And that matters so much for anyone who has ever cried out in pain and heard nothing back but the echo of their own voice. Because when you are in the middle of spiritual warfare, when you are in the middle of suffering, when your faith is being tested, when your heart is exhausted, the greatest temptation is to interpret silence as proof that nothing is happening. But in Scripture, silence often hides holy activity. Silence often covers a deeper work. Silence often means God is doing something that cannot yet be explained in simple terms. Job wanted information. He wanted answers. He wanted reasons. He wanted clarity. He wanted the timeline. He wanted the why. But what God was doing was deeper than giving Job quick information. God was doing something inside Job that could not be produced by easy explanations. God was bringing Job into a deeper knowledge of himself. God was stripping away every false foundation. God was exposing the fragility of human understanding. God was proving that genuine faith can survive even when comfort disappears. God was revealing that relationship with him is deeper than visible blessing. That is why this part of Job hits so hard. Job does not know there is a heavenly conversation. Job does not know that there are spiritual dimensions to his suffering. Job does not know that limits have been set. Job does not know that even in his pain, he is not outside the hand of God. And that is exactly how many people feel today. You may not know what is happening behind the scenes of your life. You may not know what God is preventing. You may not know what attack did not fully reach you because God restrained it. You may not know what spiritual battle is taking place around your obedience, your endurance, your worship, your future, your family, your calling. You may not know why the door closed, why the answer delayed, why the healing has not yet come, why the burden has lasted longer than you expected. But the message of Job is that your lack of visibility does not mean God lacks activity. Your inability to see does not mean God is doing nothing. Your confusion is real, but it is not proof of divine absence. And this is where the perspective shifts in a powerful way. Many people want a God who explains everything immediately, a God who gives instant answers, instant comfort, instant understanding, instant resolution. But the book of Job reveals that God often prioritizes transformation over information. He is not committed to satisfying human curiosity on demand. He is committed to forming something deeper in the soul. He is committed to shaping trust that does not depend on immediate explanation. He is committed to building a relationship that is not based only on visible blessings, quick miracles, or clear timelines. That is why silence can become such a painful but powerful place. Because in silence, God is teaching the believer to seek his heart, not just his hand. In silence, God is revealing whether we want him or only his benefits. In silence, God is pulling us beyond shallow faith and into deeper surrender. And that is uncomfortable because most people would rather have fast answers than deep transformation. We want God to tell us why before he changes us through it. We want the explanation before the endurance. We want the outcome before the trust. But Job shows that sometimes God does his most profound work where explanation is withheld. Sometimes the silence itself becomes the furnace where faith is purified. Sometimes what feels like divine distance is actually the setting where God is undoing pride, exposing idols, deepening dependence, and teaching a soul to rest in his sovereignty, even without understanding every detail. That does not make the pain less real. It does not minimize the tears. It does not mean suffering is easy. But it means suffering is not meaningless. It means silence is not empty. It means heaven is not passive. And maybe that is the word someone needs right now. Just because God has not explained himself does not mean he has abandoned you. Just because you cannot trace his hand does not mean his hand is gone. Just because the chapter feels dark does not mean the author has left the story. In the life of Job, God was closer than Job imagined, but God was not giving explanations on Job's terms. And that is one of the hardest lessons in biblical faith. The presence of God is not always felt through immediate answers. Sometimes his presence is hidden beneath mystery, held inside sovereignty, wrapped in silence, and revealed only later. And when that finally begins to sink in, the question starts to change. The question is no longer only, why is God silent? The deeper question becomes, what is God forming in me while he is silent? And that is where the book of Job starts to move from pain alone into something even more powerful. Because once the soul begins to see that God's silence is not inactivity, it becomes possible to endure the waiting with a different kind of vision, and that opens the door to what happens when God finally speaks. And then, after all the silence, after all the pain, after all the questions that seem to rise to heaven and fall back unanswered, God finally speaks. This is the moment the entire book of Job has been moving toward. This is the moment the tension has been building around. Because when you read Job, you keep waiting for the explanation. You keep expecting God to step in and say, Job, this is why it happened. This is what was going on. This is the reason for your suffering. But when God finally opens his mouth, that is not what happens. He does not explain the loss of the children. He does not explain the loss of the wealth. He does not explain the sickness, the grief, the mourning, or the silence that felt so heavy for so long. He does not answer the question why in the way human pain wants it answered. Instead, God does something deeper, something greater, something far more powerful than a simple explanation. He reveals who he is, and this changes everything. Because the greatest turning point in the story of Job is not when his suffering begins, and it is not even when his circumstances later change. The greatest turning point is when the voice of God breaks into the darkness, not with a tidy answer, not with a detailed breakdown, not with a step-by-step explanation of heaven's hidden purposes, but with a revelation of divine majesty, divine wisdom, divine sovereignty, and divine glory. God speaks out of the whirlwind, and the first thing that becomes painfully clear is that Job is not standing before a small God who needs to justify himself. He is standing before the creator of heaven and earth, the one who laid the foundations of the world, the one who commands the seas, the stars, the lightning, the snow, the wild animals, and the mysteries of creation that no human mind can fully grasp. This is what makes this moment so overwhelming. Job had been crying out for answers, but when God appears, the conversation is immediately lifted to a much higher level. God does not enter into debate with human understanding as if he were merely one voice among many. He speaks as the Lord. He speaks as the sovereign king. He speaks as the one whose wisdom stretches beyond history, beyond suffering, beyond time itself. And suddenly the book of Job is no longer centered on Job's pain alone. It is centered on the greatness of God. That is the shift. That is the holy shock of the passage. Because so often when we suffer, our entire vision narrows around our wound. Our questions become bigger than everything else. Our confusion becomes the center of the story. Our heartbreak becomes the lens through which we see God. But when God speaks, he breaks that narrow vision open. He does not minimize pain, but he overwhelms it with his presence. And that is one of the most important truths in the entire Bible. Sometimes the answer you are desperate to receive is not the answer God knows you need most. Sometimes what your soul truly needs is not information, but revelation. Not a reason you can fully decode, but a vision of the God who is still in control when your life feels out of control. Because explanations can satisfy the mind for a moment, but only the presence of God can anchor the soul. Only the reality of who God is can hold a person together when everything else has fallen apart. This is why the voice of God in Job is so powerful. It reminds us that faith is not built on having every answer. Faith is built on knowing the character of the one who rules over what we do not understand. Notice what God emphasizes. He emphasizes his greatness. He emphasizes his power. He emphasizes his unmatched wisdom. He speaks of creation in ways that expose the limits of human understanding. Where were you when the earth was formed? Can you command the morning? Can you bind the stars? Can you govern the forces of nature? Can you tame what only God can tame? These are not random poetic questions. They are revelation. They are a divine confrontation with human smallness and divine supremacy. God is showing Job and showing all of us that there are realities far beyond what we can see. There is wisdom beyond our wisdom. There is purpose beyond our perception. There is sovereignty working in places where human eyes see only chaos. And this is where the transformation in Job begins to happen. Before this moment, Job wanted answers. Before this moment, Job wanted his case heard. Before this moment, Job was longing for resolution, for explanation, for something that would make the suffering fit into a box he could understand. But after God reveals himself, something shifts inside him. The demand for answers gives way to awe. The struggle to control the mystery gives way to surrender. The heart that had been crushed under the weight of unanswered questions now stands in the presence of a God whose glory is greater than the question itself. Job realizes that the deepest issue was never simply his pain. The deepest issue was whether he could trust God without seeing the full picture. That is why one of the most moving lines in the entire book comes when Job says, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." That is the breakthrough. Job had known things about God before. He had heard of him. He had believed in him. He had served him. But now, through suffering, through silence, through confusion, through the crushing weight of pain, he comes into a deeper vision of God than he had ever known before. And this is such a powerful biblical truth because there are dimensions of God's reality that people often encounter most deeply, not in comfort, but in crisis. Not in the easy season, but in the breaking season. Not when life is simple, but when everything is stripped away and the soul has nowhere else to stand. This does not mean suffering is good in itself. It means God is so sovereign, so wise, and so powerful that even suffering does not have the final word. Even silence does not mean abandonment. Even unanswered prayer does not mean God has stopped being God. The God of Job is not confused. He is not absent. He is not struggling to catch up with events. He is not standing helpless before pain. He is enthroned above all things, fully wise, fully sovereign, fully aware, and fully glorious. And when that truth lands in the heart, it does not answer every question, but it changes the person who is asking them. That is why this moment matters so much for anyone walking through grief, disappointment, betrayal, loss, depression, confusion, spiritual dryness, or the silence of God. Because sometimes you keep asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and heaven seems silent. Sometimes you keep praying, "God, explain this," and no explanation comes. Sometimes you keep begging for clarity, and what you receive instead is a deeper confrontation with the greatness of God. And in that moment, you begin to understand that what your soul needed most was not a neatly packaged answer, but a greater revelation of who God is. Because when you truly see Him as sovereign, wise, holy, powerful, and good, it does not make the pain unreal, but it does make despair lose some of its power. It does make fear shrink. It does make trust possible again. And maybe that is exactly where some people are right now. Still waiting, still hurting, still confused, still carrying questions that have not been answered, still trying to make sense of something that feels impossible to explain. But the message of Job is that the silence of God is not the end of the story. There comes a moment when God speaks, and when He does, His voice does more than inform. His voice reveals. His voice humbles. His voice heals in a deeper way than explanation alone ever could. Because sometimes what you need most is not to know everything God is doing. Sometimes what you need most is to know that the God who is doing it is infinitely wise, completely sovereign, and worthy of your trust even now. If this part of the message spoke to you, comment, "Now my eyes have seen," or even just, "God is greater," down below. And if you have ever gone through a season where you wanted answers but needed God more than you realized, comment, "I still trust Him," because what happens next takes this even deeper.